So for me, my story isn't about escaping a broken situation. It's about what becomes possible when there's genuine care, genuine belief, and when opportunity meets determination. And I think that's something that, I hope we can take away from this is it's not about everything being fixed and made well again, but it's about what we can do with that and how we can support someone in finding that new trajectory, perhaps that will take them forward.
Welcome to Care Vision's Professional Talk, the discussion show that brings you vital insights from leading voices in social care, education, health, and youth development. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and I speak to trailblazers, researchers, and practitioners. And for all of those interested in how we care within our society, come join us. Whether you're a practitioner, educator, family member, or curious learner, join us to think, reflect, and grow new ideas. Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley, and this is Care Vision's Professional Talk, and my guest is a remarkable figure who at present is focusing on mental health training. From a few months old, she was raised in Britain's childcare system, both homes and fostering, and went on to become a teacher, where she had a unique insight into spotting children who were vulnerable and that personal experience of how to pull through and make a success of life. An extraordinary story with lessons for us all, and welcome, Tina Copp, to Care Vision's Professional Talk.
Brilliant. Hi, Humphrey. Thank you for having me here.
It's great. It's really great to have you, Tina. And now to ground us, your current day job, as it were, you're a mental health trainer. And you also reference one of your courses, mental health first aid. What exactly is that? Okay, so really I deliver a variety of courses that have something to do with mental health, which is where the mental health trainer bit comes in. One of the courses that I deliver is with Mental Health First Aid England. It's an accredited course called Mental Health First Aid. And there's various lengths of this course. There's a 2-day version where you can get a certificate for that, and there's shorter versions. But mainly it's about training staff and people that work with others to notice, to listen, and to respond to their colleagues or the people that they manage and line manage, and how to support them, how to signpost them. It's really not about diagnosing mental health conditions. That's not what we're qualified to do, but more how we might provide that sort of early support by noticing signs and symptoms and having those supportive conversations that might just make a difference for someone who might be experiencing some mental health challenges. Just to sort of parallel that, say, with the physical health that we're all much more familiar with, you're talking about the colleagues or friends and that where you notice symptoms like somebody's hand might be twitching, or they've got a limp, or they're eating too much or not enough, and that sort of thing. This is a similar sort of thing. So what are the symptoms that you might spot?
Well, it obviously depends on what the person's experiencing, and sometimes we might not see the symptoms. People can mask how they might be feeling about the situations that challenge them. But really, it's about noticing changes. So, for example, if someone's normally very chatty and now appears to be more withdrawn, if someone normally perhaps takes care of their appearance and seems to be neglecting their sense of hygiene and appearance, they might be sort of little signals that might point to something not being quite right. And then it's having those conversations where we might say, how's everything going? And going beyond the how are you, yes, fine, thank you type conversations into exploring a little bit more about what might be going on in someone's world.
Okay, that's great. And then the first aid element of it, many of us are familiar with the person standing on the edge of the building and calling the Samaritans or something. Sure. But what is mental health first aid, and how do you administer it?
So, similarly to the physical first aid courses, where I think the last time I did the course, it was Dr. ABC, and you had to go through various steps to make sure that you were helping someone who may have had an accident or an injury in some way. So with mental health first aid, we follow an action plan with the letters ALGEE, ALGEE, and they each stand for different parts of how we might support someone. It is a holistic approach. You don't necessarily go through them in order. You respond to the person in the situation that they're in. But the A in ALGEE stands for approach, assess, and assist a person who might be in crisis. And then the L stands for listening and communicating in a non-judgmental way. We then give support and information. We're not there to give advice because we're not qualified to. And then the 2 E's at the end stand for how we might encourage someone to access professional support, and we might signpost, and also how they might find other supports, whether that's family and friends, whether that's some self-help actions. There's all sorts of strategies that we might encourage someone who is in crisis. But we would, of course, call for emergency support, such as an ambulance or the police, if we felt that someone was in physical danger as well.
And what is a sort of situation that we can envisage on that? Because we completely understand if somebody has a heart attack or has severe burns.
Absolutely.
Is there an equivalent of testing the breathing, testing their reactions, putting them in the recovery position that you do in physical first aid?
Well, okay, I'll give you an example then. So let's say someone is facing potential redundancy, and this may lead to financial challenges and worries, and there may be other things going on, and they may start to experience high distress and panic. And the symptoms of a panic attack can be very similar to that of a heart attack or an asthma attack. So it's really important that as mental health first aiders, we don't make the mistake of thinking we know everything, but we may need to ask and assess the situation. And as I've said before, we need to respond in the moment. And if that person does need emergency support, then we need to be prepared to call 999, or we may go through a series of actions to help keep the person calm, to keep them safe, to support them through the panic attack, to help them to find a space where they feel that they can regulate their own breathing and come to that space of calm before then going on to support them in accessing other supports to help them move forward with that. Okay. So that's just one example. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could happen.
I can envisage
just one example.
Yeah, and of course that's fascinating in that the mental health element then does draw into the physical health element. You said help them with their breathing, the collapsing, the panic attack itself. That's all a physical thing, really, isn't it? We're going to come back to this later in the show because it is. But Tina's website is www.mhfaengland.org. That is not the one.
No, that's not my website. So that website offers lots of information about mental health, but my own website is actually tinacopp.com.
Oh yes, no, sorry, I meant the one for this particular issue. That's
so absolutely. Mental Health First Aid England do have absolutely a website with all the listed courses and all the information around that, and the courses that we deliver are listed there. Absolutely. I apologise.
That's right. And Tina Copp, tinacopp.com for yourself.
It's not my own website. Absolutely. A very different one. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. But I want to go back now to your beginning. I mean, to how you do, whether this is why and how you turned up from. But at 5 months old, you lost your family, as it were, and went into the care system. What happened?
So, at the age of 5 months old, my sister was 3 at the time. It turned out that my mother had left my sister and I unattended and supported, and in the hands of one of my half-brothers, who was only 9 himself, in his care. And in order to keep us warm, I think he'd set fire to some clothing, and therefore the emergency services were alerted, and our situation then was made known. So we were taken into care with a care order for our protection and to a place of safety, and we were never returned for the rest of our childhoods to our parents. My father wasn't present and in my mother's life as well. So they were alive, but very much not able to take care of us. And then, yes, we were entered into the care system, which was supposed to be a place of safety, but over the years became very clear that it was paradoxically actually very unsafe.
Just give us an example of that. So, you're 5 months old, so you won't remember much beyond 3 or 4 or 5 or something. But give us some of those early examples of understanding where you were and how you were different to children that went home to their mum and dad.
And as you say, I don't remember those early stages at all. I have no memory of it at all. But I do remember in my very early childhood memories at that feeling sense that it wasn't safe. The goalposts were constantly moved. It was a very mercurial place to live. Moods and standards often changed. It was just very unstable and unsafe, and actually quite a violent and abusive place for all of the children that lived in this particular children's home. And so it felt very volatile. You didn't feel normal compared to the school children who would go home to their parents, and sometimes children can be very cruel, and they made that very plain. Often the children from the children's home were bullied and picked on because of our status, our clothing, often called names like Fleabag because we smelled and so on. And so you were always othered and very much a sort of an outcast in your childhood. And that was a very challenging place to be. And what's strange is that you feel shame. You grow up feeling ashamed of yourself, as though you have some control over it. And that's one of the sad things I reflect on for children who are looked after, is they carry shame because of stigma. Right up until I sort of applied to go to university, even then my experience with the social services, who had many shortcomings, didn't anticipate that people like me, to use their words, would go on to have a higher education.
So can I just go back?
Yes,
go back to describe, where was the children's home? How many children were there? Just describe it. The dormitories, the furniture, and the lack of safety.
Yes. So the children's home is in Warwickshire. I'll be a little bit vague about it. There were at the time two adult carers, if you like, in the children's home, and their adult daughter, who was herself adopted, but very much treated like the Queen. So we had a dormitory of 6 beds for the girls and a small room of two beds for the 2 boys. 4 of the young people were siblings, and then my sister and I were obviously siblings, and then there were 2 other girls. So that was the sort of the setup of that. And it was very, just as I said, very volatile. It was actually a beautiful manorial building set in beautiful grounds, 7 lawns, there was an orchard. It was very, very idyllic in how it looked, which is, again, ironically, somewhere so beautiful was so haunting in its own way. It was very oppressive behind closed doors. But one could imagine that, what a lovely place to live and grow up. But it was far from that.
And the lack of safety came from the way other children treated you, or the way the carers were, or just the lack of something?
Both, really. I mean, the social services, this is where, again, I mentioned the shortcomings in the 1970s, and they very much undermined safety. The social workers, which were supposed to be the people that we would be able to talk to and have a voice with, very much deferred to those that ran the children's home, and enjoyed more visiting and having cups of tea and biscuits rather than actually taking their own roles seriously. So really, the violence and abuse that happened in the home, from both carer to children and from child to child, sort of peer-on-peer abuse, was left very much unchecked, and therefore it became a very unsafe place to be. Punishments for the most ridiculous things would be severe. So starvation, for example, for 3 days, my sister and I experienced because we'd got some cut grass on our duffel coats, and therefore we were messy. So very punishments not in line with the crime, so to speak. And that was why it was very much an unsafe and unstable place to be.
You said starvation for 3 days? They didn't feed you for 3 days?
No, absolutely not. We were made to stay in a room with the lights off, and just things like that. It was really appalling when I look back on that. I mean, there was no traffic line. There was no way to reach out and say what was happening. You felt very isolated and alone, and you didn't know where to get help. But also, you were afraid to tell, for example, teachers at school about what was going on at home, because if the carers in the children's home got wind of that, the fallout wasn't worth thinking about. As children, we certainly would steal from the local shops. We'd steal biscuits, we'd steal food as a way of compensating for the lack of food at home, and all sorts of unhelpful things, really.
So you went there straight away, but at what age did it sort of register? Did you put what your life was in the context that you've just told us? How old were you then, do you think?
Children are smart. They pick up very quickly something's not right. Even if you don't know how to change it and you have no control, you know it's not right and you know it's unfair. Children have an incredibly strong sense of fairness. And just comparing oneself with friends, at school and how they dress, for example, parties at their homes, it was just very different. I have one particular friend who I'm still very, very much friends with, a lifelong friend from my junior school years. I would go to her family home for tea, and I remember seeing her dad give her a hug, and it struck me as, wow, he'd showed this lovely affectionate moment. And I did point it out to her, and she said she didn't even notice. She hadn't noticed that he'd given her a hug because it was her normal. But I was aware that that kind of affection was very much not my normal. And you could see those comparisons straight away.
And when then, and you were how old then, would you say?
I was 9 years old, because that's when we became friends. Okay. I can still remember it.
So when after that did you experience a hug, say, for want of a better word, experience that sort of trust and affection?
Well, ironically, it came from her very family. So just to sort of skip ahead a little bit, when I was 17 and I was trying to do my A-levels, and I experienced doing a little bit of sofa surfing and struggling to keep a roof over my head. I didn't have anywhere to live whilst doing my A-levels. And this very friend's family saw my plight, saw that I was starving as well, I had no money, and invited me into their home to finish my A-levels and to offer kind of a base of support. And they, to this day, are the people I call family. I very much adore them, and that's probably where I experienced generosity of a different kind, where water was very much thicker than blood, and where people sort of showed empathy and care to someone who wasn't theirs. They opened their doors to me.
And
amazing.
You say when you were 17 you were trying to do your A-levels, you had nowhere to live and no money, as if it's a normal thing. To me, it's quite shocking. Why, when you're in this system, the British care system, as it were,
yes,
did you end up like that?
Well, I was 17 when I ended up being kicked out of a foster home at that particular time. And it was an argument over religion. So I went to a Roman Catholic school. I absolutely loved school and I have no criticism against Catholicism. But for me personally, it was a time in my life when, on a personal level, it was not a faith I wanted to continue with. I didn't want to, carry on going to mass. I didn't want to continue practicing Catholicism. And the foster carers at that time were very, very strict Catholics. And, I was being a mortal sinner, and I had no home with them if I chose not to go to church anymore. And so that was kind of the end of that. And so I was kicked out. And that was when social services, tried to find a temporary place for me to live. So I lived with a friend for about 6 weeks. I think it might have been maybe a bit longer. I can't remember. Just whilst something was set up. And then I was able to receive, I don't know how it worked financially on the benefit system, but I think I was in receipt of some kind of housing benefit. I can't remember. But the housing benefit and the bills, with the amount of money coming in, I remember I had £2 a week left for food, which is where I was starting to struggle. And I knew that I couldn't sustain that. I knew that I couldn't financially continue like that. I had no money. If I needed to go anywhere, I had to walk. I couldn't afford the bus fare. And I just needed to thankfully I had a school bus pass, so I was able to get to and from school. But it was very precarious. I remember very much relying on school meals for food. It was a very scary time. But yes, that was my normal. And yes, I did see it as normal because it was the situation I found myself in.
Age 17, you mentioned the Catholic school, so you had your care home where you did not feel safe and you were starved and all the rest of it. And then you had your school.
Yes.
And your school, you felt safe? You felt...
Yes, I did. I mean, school seemed to be strict. It had a really sort of high expectations on discipline. There were strong routines, high academic rigour. But it was consistent and it was stable. And the staff, although they were strict, they were kind. There was no unkindness there. It wasn't abusive. It was a wonderful experience for me because it was the contrast from the chaos of my home life into this place suddenly where I discovered music, I discovered books, I discovered an escape in that way. And since then went on to study English as my degree and my master's later on. But I found sort of my own space between the pages of books. I could get out of my world, which was awful, into this wonderful space of the imagination. And then music in itself was therapy. And I was able to sort of really immerse myself with that. There are certain teachers I could name who were wonderful in sort of noticing that I just needed so much encouragement, and they believed in me. They believed in my potential, and they made that very clear. And they supported me to have academic ambition and to believe that I could actually design my own pathways in a way that up to this point I thought I had no control. I was being done to, rather than having any agency or authorship of my own journey in life. So school was brilliant in that sense. I wasn't bullied at school, I'm pleased to say. This is my secondary school. Junior school was awful. Secondary school was wonderful. I loved it. It was a selective grammar school, Cardinal Wiseman girls' school at the time. It went co-ed after I'd left. But it was a really great space for me to be. And I mean, again, I've got some lifelong friends still from that place.
So you went into the care system with your sister, who was 3 years older than you. She didn't come out of it as well. Why was that, do you think?
Probably not. No, I mean, it's my theory. I'm not a psychotherapist or anything, but my sister remembers those first days of being taken into care. She remembered it. I should say remembered. She's no longer with us. She's passed away now. But she remembers the trauma of it. And I think that had a different impact on her than the trauma of the childhood that I had. So we both had the same childhood, but that initial experience, I think, traumatized her. And she remained a victim of our childhood. And she said as much. She actually once said to me, her words were, the people who looked after us, they've ruined our lives, haven't they? And I remember saying, no, I'm claiming my life back. And I remember she just didn't. And sadly, she very much relied on alcohol and substances, I think, to keep herself sane. She struggled through life. She has a lovely son who is a complete credit to her. But sadly, she herself, in my view, didn't manage the experience of our childhood, and it went on to
and she
her
didn't
really...
have did she go to the Catholic school that you went to?
No.
Or?
No,
So
she
what
didn't.
happened there?
So she went on from our junior school to the feeder senior school in Coventry, and it was an awful school, which I'm pleased to say is flattened and is no more. But it was an awful school with very, very low standards, sort of high success rate academically, and came away with one CSE, I think, very little in terms of qualifications. Don't get me wrong, I think my sister, her potential, she could have been an academic. She could have easily gone on to succeed, but just perhaps for different reasons, that wasn't her trajectory. But so, no, we went to different schools. And sadly as well, the other part of the system that failed us was when we were babies, there was the potential for myself, anyway, at age 5 months, I was put up for adoption by a couple. It's all in my records. But it was seen best to not split the sisters. And so we were kept together, and consequently adoption didn't happen for either of us. And we went through the care system. But at the age of 12, I was 12, my sister was turning 15, we were sent to separate foster care homes. And it's like, it didn't kind of follow through then.
Yeah.
And I think she sadly went to some places which I don't think were good. She got into habits and drugs and things that perhaps weren't so helpful for her trajectory. And that's where we went down two different paths.
This is the reason. Thank you so much for that, because on this show, we've talked a lot about therapeutic care, this continuity, social pedagogy, which is about this whole sort of holistic thing. And I think you told, when we talked earlier, you had 7 or 8 placements. You were in one until you were 17, and then you had, or until a certain age, and then you had a heap of them. So you didn't have this continuity of a relationship with a mentor or a carer.
No, correct. So the biggest chunk of my life, I think there were 2 or 3 placements between the age of 5 months and 3. I can't remember exactly. It's written down somewhere. But then between 3 and about 12, I was in the children's home and that, with my sister. And that was the biggest kind of formative years, very, very sort of influenced that sort of childhood trauma. That was perhaps the most abusive of the places that I lived in. And then we went on to different, my sister went to another children's home. I went on to different foster carers. She then ended up in different foster carers through till I was 17. At about 16, I'd gone to this Catholic family, again, where things turned very sour.
Yeah.
And that's that. So it was very inconsistent. I do remember one set of foster parents actually saying on my very first day, I hadn't even slept there the night, "You're here because we're paid for having you, and if you want pocket money, you must earn it." And that was the welcome kind of speech. And of
no
course,
hug,
no. Immediately there was a barrier for me of trust. I didn't trust them immediately. And that placement was for 6 months. Another year, and I am beginning to forget the order of events, but for another year I lived with this wonderful family who had 2 sons, very, very inclusive of me, took me on their family holidays, made me feel very wanted. But that was a short-term placement, so it didn't last beyond the 1 year. So real mix. And in actual fact, that was that couple that got me piano lessons, which was really a great starting point for me. So I'll thank them for that.
So I think I just wanted to, the two, in your children's home, you had carers or the owners that starved you for 3 days and kept you in dark rooms. And then in one of the foster homes, you had a Catholic home there that actually threw you out onto the streets because you didn't want to adhere. That doesn't sound very sort of Christian to me, but and you sort of pushed your way through all that, and trained to be a teacher, and ended up, or not ended up, you thrived in sort of teaching girls of unsafe. And did you notice? Were you able to notice in people those who had been abused or might be being abused like you were and needed help? And
I mean, there's people that work in education, and it has got better since I started teaching 30 years ago around safeguarding. There's a lot more training now to identify and recognise where there may be concerns about a child's safety and safeguarding. And I'm really pleased to see so much change over the years, sadly following tragedies for children where abuse has been in the home. But there's definitely more of a shift in noticing, caring and following through with what young people might have in terms of support. But I'd say that there's the supports there for children now that again didn't exist back in my day, like Childline. And as a youth mental health first aider instructor, I train people to recognise those early signs and symptoms in young children and in people. It might come through the way that they perform in their work. It might come through a behaviour, including things like self-harm. But very much it comes out in behaviour the most. When children are in distress, the only thing that they can use as a power tool is their behaviour. Because if they feel like they lack voice or lack agency or something's going on, they may have behaviours which can sometimes be seen as disruptive and so on. But actually, they're the ones that perhaps need the most support and need recognition that something might be going on in that young person's world, and there perhaps needs a little bit more exploration as to what that might be.
And in the time that you went through this experience, your childhood experience, and you said it's improved, has it improved enough in the care system? I don't know how much you're in touch with it now, but what else can it do?
It's mixed stories. You still hear in the news of people in care systems which are failing young people today. We still hear of that. But not to forget that children in all sorts of homes, including their own families, can go through situations that are neglectful or abusive and so on. And it's not isolated to children in looked after situations. I'd still say that there are a lot more mechanisms in place to protect children from physical abuse. But in terms of emotional abuse and emotional support, I still don't think there'll ever be enough. At the end of the day, young people yearn for belonging, connection, place. They need to feel safe. They need to feel supported. They need to feel that they're heard, that they have a voice. And I'd like to think that more and more is being done to let that happen. But I think there's a long way to go.
And a lack of understanding too amongst the professionals in the care industry.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
I mean, in your case, when you were 9, you saw your friend hug a father, and you were taken into that environment. and you knew what you were missing, but you knew
Yes.
also that it wasn't yours. You didn't have that.
Yeah.
How do you feel now? I mean, do you know, or the people you deal with, do you know the bits that come together? Like the school was
Yes.
the ballast, wasn't
I
it?
mean, in one way, you can never get it back. You can't repeat history, but you can certainly take forward. You can take your life back. You can control your trajectory. You can become the author. And as a parent of two fabulous daughters, they're young adults now. One of my, I'm not the perfect mother, but I absolutely determined to be the mum I would have liked, and to be affectionate, to be safe, to be consistent, to be strong for them whenever they needed that. And that's something I feel that I can follow through with, that I have followed through with. But also how I'm compassionate to people I work with, whether they're the students, whether they're people that I work for, and other little things that I do, such as some voluntary work that I do. I can sort of use my experience, use the things that were lacking, can't be replaced, to try and be one of those strengths, like the strengths that I experienced in my upbringing. But you can't get it back. I still do have some of the sort of traces of the childhood trauma that I experienced, and I sometimes feel sad about that. But, you know.
And have you been, actually, this is our audience here are professionals in the trade, a lot of them with the, looking after children. Can you encapsulate a sort of message for them from your experience, and that you are now a professional, but you were, one of the people the professionals deal with?
Yeah. I think one of the things I think about my teaching career is, what am I there to do? I'm not there to sort of teach content. I'm there to teach people. People are whole people. So yes, there is the academic element, but I'm not there just to teach a subject. I'm teaching people, and it's about the whole story. And so I think when anyone working with any child in any context, whether in education, whether by being a carer in a home where children live, it's about giving voice, a sense of agency, giving children genuine connection, and genuinely working with them about their pathways rather than doing to. And I still think it's sad to this day that, we're certainly not supposed to hug children, we're not supposed to touch them in any way. But I know that I crave that kind of affection, and it's finding the appropriate ways to still find connection, warm connection with children, even though we have to do that within the boundaries that we have in our roles as carers of children. So I think it's finding things like that. And rather than reinforcing disadvantage, one of my key messages is thinking about whatever we do, we should interrupt disadvantage, not reinforce it. And, going back to the failings of the shortcomings of the social services back in the 70s, I think we need to be challenging things that aren't working for young people and being a voice and an advocate to help them in some way. The youth mental health training courses, what I love about them is they highlight some of the challenges from a young person's perspective, and they give adults who work with young people more of the confidence, the tools to start those supportive conversations, to notice when things aren't right, either in the home or in school and so on, and tools to how to approach it. And obviously there's complications there with social media and all the sorts of things going on in the world at the moment. But these courses do help to prepare adults to support young people in a really meaningful way.
And in your situation, you were actually deterred from making a success of your life, weren't you? You mentioned you were told that you would never get to university, you'd never do this. Did you just go through that? And
That's absolutely right. So a foster carer, I remember vividly her saying to me that by the time I was 16, I must have been about 15 at the time, I'm guessing, that by the time I was 16, I would be pregnant and living in a flat on my own, that I would amount to nothing, basically. And it gave me, I remember being so angry with this poor expectation of my life it gave me something to fight against. My determination was fueled by this. Okay, I'm going to prove you wrong. So if I get an education, I won't be stuck at 16 in a flat. If I don't sleep around, I won't be stuck at 16 in a flat, pregnant with very little hope for a decent future. And I remember that drove me rather than deterred me. And that message to young people is we should believe in them, believe let them have dreams and high expectations and work with them towards that. Give them that sort of empowerment to take control, because young people feel that they have no control. They have little say. Everything is being done to them. And so in a world where someone's always making the decisions for you, by having belief in a young person might help grow that determination to fight through. But that was certainly, for me, fuel to fire. And that determination is still very much there, is not letting something drag you down. I love is it Nolite te Bastardes Coronandorum? I can't say the Latin phrase from The Handmaid's Tale. I absolutely love that sentiment of don't let others grind you down. Don't let that happen. That's not, take control.
Don't let abuse grind you down, and push back against the dream killers, the negative people that say you can't go anywhere. Just throw them into the bin and keep moving on.
Easy to say than to do.
And before we finish, it's been a wonderful conversation. But tell us a little bit about your voluntary work that you do. Because you just said you've come back from a session there, and how that feeds into the the mental health first aid that we started talking about.
No, absolutely. So I do a couple of different things. So just over the Christmas period, I volunteer with Crisis at Christmas, who open up hotels and day centres for people experiencing homelessness. And for about a month, people are given a room, they're given dignity, they're given opportunity to get clean clothing, food. And one gentleman that we supported, freezing cold, that icy patch we had a few weeks ago, very thin clothing, nothing protective. His shoes were awful. He came in, someone opened the door for him. Someone smiled at him, made him a cup of tea, and they found new clothes for him that were warm and fitting, and then gave him a room with a bathroom and a safe space to sleep. And he was crying and just said for a whole year he'd been ignored. People didn't even speak to him. They'd, no acknowledgement of their existence, and suddenly they're being treated with some kind of dignity and respect. And so that really speaks to me because, as I said, I know that brush with homelessness. I know what despair looks like. I've faced it, and it's a very, very scary place to be when you think, I don't know what to do. I have no money. I can't get out of this situation. It's a very scary place. So that's really kind of given me a drive and an empathy to work with people who are challenged in similar ways. I'm not saying that I have it as hard as some of these people. I probably don't. But nonetheless, that work has been incredibly rewarding to do, to volunteer. And it's certainly something I'm always plugging for. Please volunteer, even if it's just for a day. But you come away with more than you give. That connection with people, that reward is absolutely beautiful. You're having the most amazing conversations with people with incredible stories. But it does come from a place where I want to make a difference, where I know that people in my life when I was desperate made a difference for me. And then the other thing I do voluntarily is I volunteer for a crisis text line called Shout. So like the Samaritans, who can be accessed by phone on 116 123 24 hours a day, the Shout text line is very similar. So it's a text line 85258, which again, people can access 24/7. 1 in 3 of the texters are in crisis, and most of the texters are aged between 14 and 35. A lot of young people on there. And it's probably because they prefer to text rather than talk. It's the sort of the day of using your phone
and
rather
then you
than
text back, do you?
Yes, I mean, it's not a very safe system. And we're trained to support young people who are maybe in crisis. But we also have a safeguarding team, clinical psychologists on the platform who are there to add that sort of professional layer of support for young people. So that's an absolutely wonderful provision that young people can access that I've been trained in.
And I just saw the website for that is www.giveusashout.org. Is that right? And people can volunteer for that, can they? As well as
I don't know if they're training new people at the moment. I think they've got a capacity of volunteers at the moment, but certainly keep an eye on that website if there are opportunities, because the training is amazing. It's 25 hours of self-learning online, and it really does give tools for supporting young people. Well, anyone in crisis.
Tina, we are out of time. Time's winged chariot has attacked us. Thank you, guests. As I said earlier, you're in the profession, but you're also a child of that profession. So before I let you go, give Care Vision's professional talk one last thought to take away.
Yeah, okay. A couple of gems then. So for me, my story isn't about escaping a broken situation. It's about what becomes possible when there's genuine care, genuine belief, and when opportunity meets determination. And I think that's something that, I hope we can take away from this is it's not about everything being fixed and made well again, but it's about what we can do with that and how we can support someone in finding that new trajectory, perhaps that will take them forward.
Love it, and thanks so much for my one. Is ignore the dream killers. I think you could almost do a whole manual on that, couldn't
Absolutely.
it? The people would say you are a living example of somebody who's punched their way through. For any comments, questions, challenges even to Tina Copp, please get in touch with us at professionaltalk@carevisions.co.uk. You can contact Tina directly at tinacopp.com. Is that right? Tina Copp,
absolutely.
Yeah, and for the first aid. The first aid, health, mental health first aid at www.mhfaengland.org. And for the final one that we did, give us a shout, www.giveusashout.org, which is another of the organizations that Tina volunteers for on top of her day job. Thanks so much, Tina. You've really lifted my spirit on slaying the dream killers. And until our next professional talk, everyone, stay safe and goodbye. To hear more episodes, discover upcoming discussions, or access free tools and resources, scroll down to the episode description for all the links. And from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all at Care Visions, stay safe and goodbye.